So the institution that you mentioned that pops to mind for me is family. I recently wrote an op-ed about the struggles among boys and men that are unfortunately now kind of self-propagating, where if you have men who are failing, then you have lower rates of family formation. You have kids who are being born to single moms. I think it's up to over 40% in the US now. There are adverse outcomes among boys in particular who are brought up in those types of environments. I don't know if, about your personal situation. I'm a dad myself,
I
so
am
I've
too.
got, yes. How old are your kids?
My kids are 9 and 11.
Wow, I've got a 9-year-old and a 6-year-old. And I have said to people, Yuval, I never would have even considered running for president if not for my experiences as a parent. Where when our first son was born, he was autistic. We did not know that. It was a very, very difficult baby and toddler. And the strain on the family was extraordinary. And I remember thinking, I have no idea how people could get through this alone, because in our case, it was my wife Evelyn and I, I ran for president because I thought I might be able to help the situation for people who are struggling at that level, like at home, with the family. So this is to me like a building block, as you suggest. There's no
Yeah.
more important institution. And I proposed something that I took a little bit of heat for, but mainly people liked. I said, hey, I think we should just pay for marriage counseling for anyone who wants it. Like if you're struggling in a relationship and you want to have someone help you with your relationship with your partner, that's a social win. Like if you stay together, it's a win. Like I could do the math on it if you wanted to, but et cetera, et cetera. That's like the first institution I think of, and for whatever reason, we're in a strange time where I think if you say something about pro-family, like that gets freighted politically in certain ways.
One of the worst things about the character of contemporary partisanship is that because everything has to be politicized, things just sort of fall on one side or the other of our politics, and people in one party feel like they have to be against something because people in the other have made it their big issue. And this certainly happened with family issues. I mean, the idea that to talk about providing support for families is to take a stark, polarized partisan position is, I think, bizarre. We can certainly argue about how to support families, and I think there may be just some distinctly left or right ways of thinking about that. But the notion that there ought to be a role for society as a whole to provide support for family formation and for family durability, it seems to me should be uncontroversial. It certainly is controversial. And, the character of this moment is that essentially everything is controversial. I mean, you can't take any position without it being identified as, in one sense or another, a rejection of the opposite party. I think family is the foundation of society. That's not because of our kind of society in particular. It's because of what it is to be a human being.
That feels fairly universal.
Yeah, I mean,
That shouldn't be
human
like
beings are never born alone. They're always born in families, and one way or another, that's how we're formed to be what we become.
So you've been a part of politics and public life in some form for, gosh, not to date you, but like going on a couple of decades. And during that time, there's been a real erosion, maybe even collapse of institutional trust.
Yeah.
How do you see that decline as tied to this polarization that you're describing, which I'm sure you'd agree has gotten much, much worse in recent years?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's no question that we're living through a period of declining, even collapsing public confidence in institutions. That much is, it's almost a cliche by now to say so. And the data behind it is very, very strong. Decades of public opinion research. It's not just political institutions. It's every kind of institution, from religion to big business, to banks, to the media, to universities, and certainly the institutions of our government, just have less of the public's confidence now than they used to. There are a variety of reasons why that happens. I mean, in some ways it is overdetermined, but there's some reasons that are especially distinct to our time. I mean, I think, one kind of universal reason for mistrust is corruption. And there's plenty of corruption in our time, but there's plenty of corruption in every time. It doesn't quite explain the trajectory. Similarly, incompetence, sometimes you don't trust an institution just because it doesn't do its job very well. And there are always reasons for that kind of mistrust. But I think one thing that's distinct in our time is a sense that our institutions are not forming trustworthy people. That is, as I talked about institutions before, you think of them as shaping a certain kind of human type. And oftentimes, the reason you trust that human type has to do with boundaries that are set by the institution, right? I trust my accountant, not so much because she just knows all the tax laws, I hope she does, but because there are things an accountant would never do, would never sign her name to. And for that reason, I can trust what she does do. You could say that about a lot of professionals in particular, but a lot of people in general who are shaped by institutions. It's the constraint that gives us trust. There are things a journalist who's really a journalist wouldn't say without checking. There are things a scientist would not claim without evidence.
You should check on that journalism one.
I know. Who's a journalist, right? If we were to trust institutions, if we were to trust journalists, if we can think back to a time when we might have, that would have been the reason why. And I think in our time, and as what you say about journalists suggests, in our time, we've lost the sense that people are actually constrained by these institutional boundaries. And instead, we have a sense that people use the institutions that they're part of as platforms for themselves. You can see it in journalism. A lot of political journalists now, if you check in on Twitter right now, you'd find some elite political journalists just building their own brand, not acting within an institution, within layers of editing and verification, but standing on top of institutions. I'm a New York Times reporter, and so you should care what I think, and acting as individuals, liberated from those kinds of constraints. Those people become very hard to trust. And
wow.
A lot of our institutions now essentially elevate individuals that way, rather than constraining them in a way that makes them trustworthy. That's true in the media. It's true in the academy. It's true in politics. A lot of people now run for Congress, not to be the human type that is a legislator, but to build a personal following, to build their brand, to build their social media following, or to get a better time slot on cable news. And what they're doing is not recognizably institutional, and therefore is very hard to trust. I think a lot of our loss of trust has had to do with that. And it's connected, to return to your question, it's connected very much to partisan divisions and polarization, because a lot of what people do with that prominence that they get by standing on top of institutions as platforms is participate in the culture war. And so, being a prominent pastor means you get to show that you are part of this team and not that team. Being a prominent professor means that you have a platform for expressing affinity and solidarity with your own team in the culture war. Obviously, it happens in the media. Obviously, it happens in corporate America and in politics. And so in that sense, I think the weakening of institutional constraints has a huge amount to do with the intensification of polarization and partisan animosity in this century.
Well, you're like one of these old school anti-corruption institutionalists where you're like, hey, you're representing this very important organization or august body, so you should never be beating your chest in that way. I can see why you didn't like Trump.
Yeah, no kidding. I mean, here's a guy who was not shaped by any of the institutions that normally shape our presidents, right? He's the first president we ever had who had not held any public office before of any kind. And
I resemble that, but continue.
Well, no, but part of what that means is that he doesn't take his cues from those formative political institutions. And I think that has expressed itself in everything that he had done before. He had basically been a performer. And he wanted to be president to be a performer on a bigger stage. And that's what he was. And, I think that ultimately we always have to be, in order to have any kind of integrity in life, we have to ask ourselves, given the role that I have here, how should I behave? And maybe that role is I'm somebody's father, or I'm a professional, or I'm a neighbor, or a friend. Given that, how should I behave in this situation? That's what a person with integrity asks themselves. And I think that this kind of deformation of our institutions that encourages people to just think of themselves as performers takes away the incentive to ask that question. And the result is just a lot of irresponsibility.